And I'm also going to go ahead and hit the mute all button. So Sharla and Beth, you'll need to unmute yourselves when the time comes. Welcome, everybody. We are so glad you're here. And just as Rebecca has so ably demonstrated for us, will you please drop into the chat where you're coming in from, what you're currently working on, just so that we get a sense of who is here tonight, so that you can kind of get a sense of who else is here as well. We are so glad to have you. We are going to talk about a life in paper tonight, which is both the title of Beth Kephart's latest book and who and what Beth Kephart is. She has a life in paper. She has created a life in paper, and it's a life that I think all of us would really admire and love to have as well. So if you're just joining us, please do drop into the chat. Where are you coming in from? What are you currently working on? And before we dive into our main episode, hey, co-host Sharla Yates, who co-hosts the Craft Talks webinar series with me, as well as being our co-host here at the Writers Bridge. Sharla, what's coming up with Craft Talks?
Hello, welcome everybody. I'm off mute, good. So Craft Talks, we don't have a webinar this week, but I'm very excited about Saturday because we have our first masterclass on character development for memoirists with Beth Kephart, who's here today. We will uncover the nuanced techniques of character development, learn some techniques employed by established memoirists, write and share work. It's day long, but there is a break. And again, it's this Saturday. And I'm going to go ahead and drop the link into the chat. And there's also, it's the top of the month. Email just went out about everything that's happening in June. So you might want to check that out as well.
Brilliant.
Allison, what do you have going on?
So tomorrow I'm actually teaching a webinar for Jane Friedman called Writer Mind, Marketing Mind. Some of you may remember that I taught it last year, and I've really made an awful lot of changes in the lesson because I feel like social media is functionally dead in the way we used to use it, and yet it is so valuable and important and incredible for literary community. And I want to talk about how do we build literary community in real life? How do we build our platform as we write our book? And how do we figure out exactly what am I supposed to be doing to promote my book, whether that's my memoir or my novel or my picture book or my children's book or my YA? And how do we find out what things we're supposed to do and how do we actually do them? I have actually limited myself to no more than 45 slides, and my goal is to make this webinar slightly less overwhelming. So if nothing else, you may want to turn up to that tomorrow and just see if it is even possible for me to achieve that. We have a fantastic guest with us today. Hey, Sharla, will you introduce our amazing guest?
I'm really excited because we've had Beth Kephart on Craft Talks, but I knew her before that. And Beth is an award-winning author of some 40 books in multiple genres, and an award-winning teacher and a book artist. Wife, Daughter, Self, and Memoir and Essays was named one of the 35 of the best book club books by Independent Review. Good Books for Bad Children, The Genius of Ursula Nordstrom was released from Anne Schwartz Books, Random House in September 2023. My Life in Paper, Adventures in Ephemera was recently released by Temple University Press, and Beth's book arts were featured at the New York Historical Society design event in November 2023. And I'm going to drop the links to her everything in the chat right now.
Love that. Absolutely love that. So Beth, you have had a long literary career. You and I have moved in the same literary circles for a number of years now. We were just talking about meeting up at Hippocamp a few years ago. People in the chat are already dropping how your book, Handling the Truth, was a game changer. They've learned so much from your webinars. They love you. How did you start? How did you start writing? How did you start writing in the world?
I was writing poems, and thank you so much for having me here. It was really an honor. And thank you for those who are saying such nice things in the chat room. I confess right now that I am like day 5 of COVID, so I'm usually a little less, I hope to be as animated as I am in real life. I'll put it that way. I will be taking a nap shortly after we close. I started writing when I was 9. I was writing poetry, and it corresponded to my life as an ice skater. I was out on a Boston pond teaching myself to skate, then moved to Delaware. My parents were generous and got me lessons, and I became a choreographer of my own ice skating. And the writing and the choreography and the movement on ice and the movement across the page became these handrails for me across my life. I went to the University of Pennsylvania. I studied the history and sociology of science. I left that university experience and went to work in the world of architects. I wrote marketing material for them, books for them, and I had a very specific reason for doing that. My uncle Lloyd had designed the Waldorf Astoria and so many other interesting buildings, and I grew up wanting to spend time with an architect. So there I was at an architecture firm, and there this cute guy was who became my husband and has been for decades now. He was there for a few months before heading off to Yale to get his master's. And we continued our relationship, and we married about a week after he graduated from Yale. We knew nothing about each other. Very little, because I would write letters and letters to him, and he would send an occasional watercolor through the mail to me. All through Penn. I wrote very bad poetry at Radnor High. I had this moment at the university when I was at Penn, my freshman year, where I was putting up all these poems that I was working on the wall, corkboard and a pin. And I walked in one day and discovered a group of people laughing at my poetry. It was a moment of high shame. And I took all those poems down and I stuffed them in a box, and I stopped writing for a while. But I discovered after I was married that I just couldn't live without writing. My whole rhythm is off if I'm not doing something that in some way is searching for narrative. And so I began to write essays and short stories. I published about 36 short stories, and I think about that now. And I don't think I could, again, publish short stories in the kind of literary magazines that I was publishing then. But somehow, through the mail, coming back and forth, I was publishing these short stories. And then, and this is very ironic, and I tell all of you this, it's not something I've actually shared, but the first published essay that I have shared this, was about losing the one thing my grandmother, who died when I was 9, had left to me, which was a very modest, I come from modest circumstances, a very modest pearl. And I lost it out on a playground with my son. I could never, the chain had broken, I could never find it. And my first published essay went back and forth from the Iowa woman to me, 1,000 words, several edits. And I had chosen that magazine because a writer that I had thought a lot of had published there first. And this is how my career has been. I haven't known writers. The first writer I ever met was when our son was about 2 or 3. Her name was Ephemera. I was driving Jeremy home on the Lincoln Drive, and I heard Ephemera's voice on NPR, and she was going to be in Philadelphia. And I thought, I have to meet a writer. And I turned the car around, and my husband, who worked in the city at the time, was able to watch Jeremy in the basement of the Borders and, on Walnut Street. Yes. And I stood in that line. I was mesmerized by Ephemera. And the first thing that I learned was how important the voice, the actual reading voice, is in conveying a story. The way she read versus what was on the page, the way she read out loud, teaching me how to read her on the page. And I stood in line, and I was the last person there. And I do not have any recollection of how she got my address. But about 3 months later, I got a pen. She had been in China, and she sent me a pen to my home in Glenside, PA, and it said, "You are a writer." And it was my first experience. And then later, I wrote to Natalie Kutz, a writer I adored, and she wrote back to me. And later, I wrote to Michael Ondaatje, and he wrote back to me. And it was in the companionship of these people from far away that I built the sense that maybe I would find a community to fit into.
That's so beautiful. And I have to tell people that Beth also is that generous. I mean, she sent me something that she made. So just it continues. What is Life in Paper, and why is that your latest book?
My life in paper, when my father died in August 2020, I did not want to have anything to do with words on a page. I had been taking care of him. We had an intense relationship, not always perfect, but I loved him dearly. I'm a lot like him, for better or for worse. And he died during COVID, and I was not allowed to see him until the last 10 minutes of his life. They called, my husband drove us through a rainstorm to his bedside. His biggest thing as he aged was, I would go to funerals for him and he would say, count the number of people who went. And he was the most modest person you can imagine, but it mattered to him that he have a funeral, and he couldn't. It was COVID. It was my brother and my sister and me, and we buried him in the side of a hill. But what I did instead was, without any understanding, my husband, the architect, became and is an extraordinary artist. What I wanted to do was to create booklets for all of the people who had known and loved my father, and there was a large number of them. And so I taught myself how to jelly print, and I taught myself how to chain stitch. And I sent about 150 of these booklets out into the world so that people could hold their memories of my father there. It was my way of giving him his funeral. I am emotional, but my life in paper then became, I began to learn how to marble paper, how to cyanotype, how to do the really hard at the time for me Coptic stitch, and I began to make books and sell them through an Etsy shop. But I began to think a lot about this question: are our lives held primarily on paper, or are they held primarily in memory and in the memories others hold of us when we're gone? And so I began to think about wills and baby books and scrapbooks and resumes and menus and these things that hold our lives. And I researched each of those, like sewing patterns. And then I also wrote a very particular, intimate, personal story that connected. You know, if I wrote about sewing patterns, it would be about my mother trying to create a skating outfit for me. And then the footnote would be an interesting story about the world's first sewing patterns, which happened to be created in Philadelphia. And woven into this are letters that I write, he's been dead since 1966, to a man named Dard Hunter, who was the world's greatest paper adventurer. He traveled 1 million miles around the world to see how communities created paper. And I began to write to him about the things that were consuming me, like grief, like loss, like what is home. And so each of those letters are thematic. My life in paper was also my search to continue to remake the memoir form. I've been interested in letters, in memoir, in the footnoted memoir, but it's not really, they're not footnotes, I call them, they're more like notes. They're stories within stories. But also, the huge question for me has always been, how do you create a universal memoir? How do you, in other words, make room for others inside your story? And it felt to me that if I addressed the big issues that concern us all to Dard, and then, you know, in the 11 sections, looked at my story with baby books, the larger story, the history, not always history, but sometimes just some interesting thoughts about baby books. Right there in between is the place for the reader. And I wanted to create that. And I was able to design the cover of the book, to the end papers are my marbled papers. There are cyanotype jelly prints down the 11 sections. There's can't see it, but sort of a faded bit of my art on the back. And it was a book that I don't have an agent for my adult work. I have an agent for my children's book. It's not that I haven't tried. It's that I don't sell enough copies of anything I do to be interesting to an agent. So how did I sell this book might come up, and I'll ask you now, is that Temple University Press had published 2 other books of mine. One was the memoir of a river, this Philadelphia Schuylkill River called Flow. There was a new editor. He didn't know me. I sent 40 pages. I was teaching at Penn. I sent them to him Tuesday morning. I went to Penn. I was on the train coming back at 6 o'clock, and he wrote and he said, "This book sounds really interesting. Let's talk on Thursday," We had a 2-hour conversation on Thursday, and it's a hard book to get your head around. It's not an easy sales pitch. And he so understood the book, and he said, no, it has to go to a board. He said, I'm going to represent this to the board, keep writing. And so that's really how most of Flow is the same book. That was my same story. Here I was a National Book Award finalist for my first memoir. I had different things that I had achieved, but I kept choosing to write books that were of deep personal interest. How to remake the form, how to remake language, how to remake how we connect people. And that's not always the most popular approach. And so by the time of Flow, I was sending it to Temple. They didn't know me from Adam at that time. And it took about 3 months. I'm telling you this as encouragement. And finally I called and I said, I bet you don't want my book, and they said, no, we want your book. We have no idea we're going to shelve it in a bookstore. And that's why we haven't gotten back to you. So I have been that anomaly. And yet, as Sharla so dearly said, I have 40 or so books out there. I have found a way around my unusualness, my idiosyncratic approach to the page.
Are all of your books published by small presses, by literary presses, by university presses?
So I've also published a number of novels for middle grade and YA. I've been published by Random House and Simon & Schuster and Norton and Houghton Mifflin. My wife, daughter, self, similar situation. I wrote to Laura Stanfill because I was aware, she's Forest Avenue Press. I was aware of something she did. I didn't send it to anybody else. I liked who Laura as an editor of this small press appeared to be. And we had a fantastic conversation, and I never sent it anywhere else. My other books, the books that I collaborate with my husband, are all published through Juncture Workshops, and maybe we'll get to that. But I teach. Bill and I have been teaching at various, since 2016 at a farm, et cetera, until COVID, and then we went online. And we wanted to create a resource, a center for those who are interested in telling true stories. So what did that entail? Well, workshops, newsletter, where I'm not writing about myself, but I'm writing most of the time. Sometimes I do. But most of the time I'm writing about ideas or feelings, or most of the time other people's books, what they can teach us. I used to put prompts down. I used to do interviews. I just had an interview with somebody, or a essay that she wrote that I asked her to write about her research process. And so what else? Well, we need books. And so we created and are continuing to create and just publish a series of books. None of these books do I take out or try to sell first. It's not like, oh, well, no one wanted it, so Juncture's going to do it. We begin with the idea, what do the small group of people that follow us, what do they need right now? And my husband and I work on that together. He designs the books. He does these absolutely gorgeous covers. This one I am so proud of. This is our first collection of essays, but it is also sort of a call and response book. And this is the galley, but where Bill is doing some art. I collected these essays of mine and wrote some new ones into 6 separate sections. And I gave him a title like Far Away and Near. And then he would, without really reading the essays, because reading my essays is not something he usually does, would create an image. And then I would respond to the image in a way that spoke to her and spoke to the essays that would follow. And it was great for me because it was like prose poetry, inspired by my husband's artwork. We do, it's important to me that we collaborate the way we do. We go out and art shows. He's also a ceramicist. But it's this conversation with one other person that we then try to carry outward into the world.
And I love this idea too, that your husband is not necessarily reading your work. And yet at the same time, you have this intense collaborative relationship where he is feeding your work, which I would argue is actually more valuable than him reading your work. You probably have other people who read your work.
I don't, except for the editors who ultimately have it, but that's a beautiful thing, an important thing that you said. Yes, he feeds my work by who he is, by the grace with which he approaches his extraordinary art, by the way he leaves me alone. Look, I'm married to this guy who can do anything with art, anything, ceramicist, book design, illustration, whatever it is. And he doesn't come in over my shoulder when I'm in grief, mourning my father, and say, you know, you should probably start your change stitch an inch down, or, you know, that color combination might not work. So did you really need to do 4 impressions on that jelly print? Never. Somehow he's watching, and somehow for Christmas, I get a marbling kit. And somehow 6 months later or something, for Mother's Day or 5 months later, I get 2 bottles that have the solution with which you make cyanotype. What am I going to do with this? I don't know, figure it out. And then this Christmas, he gave me a sewing machine, and I was kind of angry, like, I cannot figure something else out. I don't know how to prevent this. And you know what?
I love this. I love this.
It's the best thing that's happened, because some of the art that's behind me, I'm now taking the different paper modalities and I'm stitching them together, and I'm drawing with a sewing machine. And I mean, because I'm not going to make my next dress. I'll wear my 25-year-old skirt far sooner than I am wearing, actually, I said that because I am wearing a 25-year-old skirt. But, you know, I told him, but please, we have enough. The other day, we have a very small house. Yesterday, when I'm in this COVID haze, I can barely look, you know, and he's going, you know, your office, which is where I do a lot of my writing and work for corporate. I used to work for corporations. I don't really have many clients anymore. You know, we should turn that into another workroom for you. And I said, what possible new media could I do? Please, no.
I love this. And, you know, I'm seeing a number of other people say that, you know, Julie says in the chat, my encouraging husband seldom reads my work. And many of us are weighing in to say the same thing. Brian's husband doesn't read his work. Rebecca's husband doesn't read her work. Morgan has her husband as her first reader. I'd like to invite everybody. Will you drop in the chat your partner or your supportive adult child or your supportive child or your husband or wife or spouse or whoever? Let us know, what is someone in your life who does something significant that supports your work that is not necessarily reading it? And we'd love to invite you to share some of those in the chat if you're feeling like it. Julie also asked, where did they shelve your book, Beth? Just as like a quick little aside, where did they shelve A Life in Paper?
Oh, My Life in Paper. Honestly, I don't know, because I don't go looking for my books. I think in the local area, well, new and noteworthy, but also Philadelphia. I think sometimes it goes into Memoir, and sometimes, if it's local, into Philadelphia, because there are many the first colonial paper mill was, for example, in Philadelphia. The sewing patterns. There are many firsts that somehow ended up here. And so therefore, and also I did so much work on the book, like in the Kislak Rare Library at the University of Pennsylvania. There's a lot of pen, and I was feeling very failed when I was writing this book. And that doesn't relate to where it shows up, but there's a lot of history in the book. And so sometimes it might go in the history, but I really think most of these books now are sold online.
Well, and Amazon has it shelved in both papercraft and memoir.
Is that right? You know, okay, now you just revealed something else about me. I have never gone on Amazon to look at any of my books. So I didn't know that. I refused. And some of you who follow me on Facebook know that something really weird just happened. But I have made up, since my 7th book was a young adult novel or it was a middle grade novel that HarperCollins published 5. That I judged. I was a National Book Award finalist, and then a few years later, I was the prime judge, the lead juror in the children's literature, young people's literature, which was very strange because I had never published anything remotely like that. But I gave a talk that night on the stage. I had spent a lot of time looking at these 161 books. I wrote a review of each one. I think my other jurors thought I was crazy. I had all of these ways of thinking about what is good in a book, especially for children, which went from picture book to history to, you know, everything. And I gave a talk that night in a ridiculous red velvet gown, which I have no idea why I decided to wear that. And I talked about what matters in literature. And after I gave that talk, Laura Garinger of HarperCollins asked me to write for her. And the first book I wrote for her was, and I refused for a year. And then she came down to Philadelphia and she asked for lunch with me, and I talked to her. I let her talk the whole time, encouraged her to talk. And at the end, she said, "Tell me 5 things about who you were in high school." And I told her 5 things. And she said, "All right, that's the book." And
Mm.
I had a train schedule with me and a pen, and I had taken the train into the city, and I wrote in the tiniest possible print, and I wish I had kept it. What became the first 10 pages of that book. And I emailed it to her that night, a little after midnight. And 5 minutes later, she wrote and she said, "You are doing this book with me. It's a yes."
Mm.
That's all a tangent, because what happened after that book won a lot of awards. It sold in foreign, et cetera. It sold pretty well. It sold about 35,000 copies.
And I'm
Which,
just going to say 35,000 copies is very good for
but
book
I've never
sale.
been anywhere close since then. And my first book was like that. And then my first, see, this is an interesting thing. Your first in each thing has the highest, I think, sale possibility. But I was going along innocent, and I would go to Amazon to see how it was selling. And then I saw this Amazon review, and it was just, it hated me. It hated the book. And it put me into such a state of anxiety that I have never gone onto Amazon before. So this is actually, again, and this is true. Sometimes somebody will say, "Well, can you send me a link to something?" And I will say to Bill, "Can you get the Amazon link? Just get it yourself." I can't. I can't look. I cannot go on Amazon. So
Mm.
I've never known. So thank you for telling me, Allison, where this book has been.
Yeah.
I've
Now you know where you can tell people to find it. Go ahead, Sharla.
I absolutely love all of these things that people are putting in the chat, all the people who support their work, because we truly don't create alone. And it's just a great reminder, and it's really quite beautiful. Speaking of that, Beth, you've taught quite a few classes for Craft Talks, and you are one of our most loved teachers. And I think people can understand why just listening to you talk. But what is your philosophy about teaching, and what drives you to help other writers?
It's a hard question to answer, because teaching comes to me at so many levels. I think teaching, first and foremost, is a conversation. And I'm really interested in what other people are working on. I'm really interested in what is happening beyond what they're working on. And one of the many things I like to do is to find just the right books for just that right person, so that even if I'm doing 12 people in a workshop at a farm, in 2016, each person there, those would be like 10-hour days, and they would be deeply, craft oriented, and some prompts and private time with me, but really getting to know each individual person and saying, "This is the right book or books or process for you." Or maybe you're not really at work at a memoir, you're working at something else. So there's a problem solving that goes on. And I'm so steeped, my little house is breaking down with so many books that are in it. I buy so many books, and many of them not because I would even want to read them myself, because I'll be thinking, well, she is working on a certain kind of story right now. Let me see if this book is a good exemplar, or something that I'm going to tell her, don't wade into this territory. Read this book and ask yourself, do you want yourself to sound like this? Do you want yourself to be perceived like this? Let's step back. So there's a lot of problem solving. There's a lot of just being there for, as my voice, there for people. And also I think it's sort of a noble profession.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of do.
What book, Jane asked this, what book was created out of that high school prompt again? What was the title of that book?
Oh, it was called, now you're going to go look on Amazon to see. I'll give you a clue what the person said, that I must be, I forget how many years old, 100 or 700 years old, to write a book in which I used the word trousers. That is the thing that was it. It was called Undercover.
Everyone has belly buttons. Everybody has a pin.
I love it. I absolutely love it. You have such this rich, beautiful writing and visually creative life, but you also teach. And I'm going to say that anyone who ever says those who can't do teach, I will punch you in the face, because as any Olympic gymnastics coach can tell you, teaching and doing are not the same thing at all. So what calls you to teaching, Beth? You're amazing at it. What called you to teaching? Why do you teach? What's your philosophy of teaching? What drives you to work with other writers?
Well, in addition to some of what I just said about teaching, which it is hard to talk it through, I worked at corporate America to support my family, and so I was writing speeches for CEOs, and I was writing employee statements and patient stories. Um, and the part of it that I loved was the patient stories. I worked for many pharmaceutical companies, and I would meet people who were experiencing really difficult things in their lives, and often became, in fact, one of my young adult novels is inspired by one of the patients that I met. Actually, two of them are two very different stories. And I just really love getting to know other people, love soliciting their stories. And then finding in those cases, I was writing the stories for them. Even with the CEOs, we'd sit for 2 or 3 hours. We would talk about cycling, the early death of a parent, brain cancer, whatever the CEO had had in their life, long before we got to, well, what is this speech about? And I think that because I've always been someone who asks a lot of questions, and then I try to fit what I hear into a narrative, I am then someone who is able to maybe turn what I've heard into the suggestion of a narrative. That's working one-on-one. These presentations that I do take weeks. I am always looking for a new way to teach something. For example, this character development. Have I taught character development before? Yes, to 35 people over Zoom. And then I wrote about it in one of your workshops, but I wasn't going to. There's about 40 minutes of what will happen on Saturday that I've talked about before. But when I said to Sharla that I'm going to do, I would like to do character development, I thought, Beth, you need to recreate this. You need to teach yourself character development all over again. I had 2 independent study students at Penn this last semester, and neither of them were very good at this. And most people, turns out, are not when they're writing memoir. There are reasons for that. And so I just went deep. I'm going to tell you, and I know, Sharla, this might twist up the order of things a little bit, but I asked myself new questions like, what do we learn about character when it intersects with and is defined by landscape? And then I went searching for examples, whether they're fiction or not, of authors who have really defined within the space of a paragraph a person in relationship to landscape. And then there are prompts that are going to come with that. I looked at character as demonstrated by the person's relationship to beauty. Okay, I'm going to go to Christina Sharp. I'm going to buy a series of new books and read them through till I find something, etc. There are others. But the point is, it's a huge puzzle for me to solve. How do I make it interesting? Okay, I found the idea. I found the examples. What are the prompts? What am I going to do with those who have then responded to the prompts? How am I going to have extra things to say after they've shared? So for me, it's 15, 16, 17 drafts of everything that I do for Sharla and Allison is brand new. And I mean, there are some pieces, 5 or 6, 7 slides. I want to be clear. I don't want to be, overstating anything, but the deep thinking about what I'm going to do is my mind on fire. And draft 7, 8, 9, 10 don't work. And I have this panic attack. I've already sold this idea. There are people signing up, and then it always fits together.
I know there's nothing like teaching something to realize how much you already know and also how much you have to learn. And then
Yes.
it is, I've learned through teaching, it's made me a much stronger writer.
Yes.
So I'm sorry, I lost my place. You are a literary writer, would I hope that's safe to say. Um, and you did talk about a bit about how you kind of go at things your own way. What, do you think that you have a platform? Do you think of it that way? How do you promote yourself or your work or what you're doing next?
You
Are you
know,
comfortable?
I don't go on tour. I never have. In the beginning, it was because we had Jeremy at home and I was taking care of him during the day and doing the corporate work at night. Um, I'm shy about that sort of thing. I think, I mean, I'll tell you something that just happened in the last few days is some of you know that a strange and very unsettling thing happened with a total stranger. And because my husband and I have just returned from El Salvador, which is his home country, and I had 4 different illnesses that I brought home with me, including this COVID. And I received a book in the mail, and after 2 days I opened it, and the book was very upsetting to me. I never put anything negative on Facebook, and I tried to be extremely nothing. I mean, I said very little about what it actually was, and certainly wouldn't name the person. I just said that it's important to lift others up instead of tear them down.
Mhm.
And I think talking about platform, I don't think of myself as having a platform, but I can tell you the kindness that was shown to me after that post, and I'm not talking about thousands of people. I thought to myself, it was a lesson. First, I thought you should never put anything negative out there. That's your thing. You don't do. But then I thought, I'm kind of glad I did because I can see that I matter. I'm just being honest. Maybe I'll regret saying this, but that I matter to some people out there. And maybe that's the most important thing. It's not about volume, but it's about knowing that people are aware of what you've tried to be as a writer, as a human, as a teacher. And I don't believe you need that in volume or high quantity.
Mm. Yeah, we have a question from, is it Andrea?
Yeah, it's Andrea.
How do you, you mentioned you leave space for others in your writing. How do you do that exactly?
Tell me the first part. I what in my writing?
How do you leave space for others in your
Oh,
story?
honey, the space. Um, well, it's this whole question of the universal, and it's about not always the overt questions, but the implied questions that your stories raise. I have had, since Handling the Truth came out in 2013, which was published by a big press, to answer, that was Gotham. Um, I've, and some of my students walk away from me because of this, and that's okay. But I have been extremely focused on the language, on the scene, on dialogue, on credibility, on a story that carries someone. But always, you're not finished with me until the story means something beyond your own ability to tell it. It has to. And I had written a piece in Catapult about this a year or so ago, right before Catapult went away. It has to say, not the book cannot be, I'm on a stage, watch me. It has to be, I'm in a room with you, have a conversation with me. A book is an implied conversation, and there are so many ways to get there, and I could give hours on this, but that's how you make space. You make space by knowing where you stand, not on the stage with a megaphone, but in a quiet room, one reader at a time. It's a conversation. It's an almost, but you wouldn't put this in the book. It was like this for me. Was it like this for you? It has to be implied. It has to be there.
Mm.
That's really beautiful. I like that a lot. And I think that ties in for me. Some of what I think is powerful about writing is that those of us who can tell the story, those of us who have survived to tell the story, those of us who were brave enough to make it through and come back and tell the story, it's our moral obligation to tell the story for the people who are unable to go on the journey or have been on the journey and don't know how to talk about it, or are in the middle of the journey and aren't sure if they're going to make it through. And I think
Yes.
that's one of the gifts that we can repay the universe for our talent and the gift of time to exercise it.
You know, what you just said, Allison, you resonate with me so much. And what you just said, it takes me back to that book Undercover, something that I haven't thought about for a long time. Now, that was a highly autobiographical novel. And and we can talk a lot, and I did in a recent webinar for Sharla and Allison about autofiction. But with Undercover, about a year after it came out, maybe, I somehow, I don't know how, a teacher found me and sent me, I think it was a Xerox or something, of a letter that a young girl had written. This is an amazing story, really. And she had felt very unappreciated and unseen, and she had gone to the back of a stage, and she had decided she didn't want to live anymore. And a teacher had given her Undercover. And that isn't the theme of my book. The theme of my book is, being invisible, which I was and often still am. But the teacher wrote and said that the girl, rather than taking her life that day, sat there behind the stage and read Undercover and emerged saying, I have been seen and I want to keep living. Now, I am not someone who gets bags full of fan mail or, you only need one or two or three or one, just one story like that to know that the time you spent on a book mattered.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
And
love that.
that's such a gift.
Yeah.
That's really beautiful. I love it. I did a one-woman show a number of years ago called True Story that involved telling true stories based on the question, what's the most important thing you're carrying with you? And there's a line from that show, all the good tricks hurt. And I had several audience members who tattooed that line on their body, and that was really interesting.
Yeah.
It's neat when a reader wants you to accompany them in that way and allows you to accompany them.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just a reminder, if you have questions for Beth, please put them in the chat. We're going to be able to ask them for you. Shar says, can you talk about why you consider a memoir thin and why weaving in another layer of story enriches it?
Oh, I think that Charlotte and I had this conversation, so thank you for asking that for this group. I have always found that when you can twine a story, for example, in Wife, Daughter, Self, a big piece of that book is about my obsession with Henriette Wyeth, who was the oldest daughter of the great illustrator N.C. Wyeth, the sister to Andrew Wyeth. And Wife, Daughter, Self, she wanted to be an artist. Her father tried to control how she wrote, how she drew, I'm sorry. Her husband, Peter Hurd, determined where they lived, not in Chadds Ford, where she wanted to be, but out in New Mexico, etc. And I so identified with her. She was a wife, she was a daughter, but what was the self of Henriette Wyeth? And I wrote 3 versions of a novel that went nowhere. I wrote a picture book that did. But in Wife, Daughter, Self, there's this longish piece in there where I am using her as my mirror. I keep looking at her and looking back at me and looking her back at me. And where I thought we had so much in common in the beginning, I'm like that, I realized that we did not. And I think that when we take landscape, history, paper, Dart Hunter, a river, whatever it is that we're obsessed with, a certain herb, a plant in our garden, when we're looking at it as hard as we are looking at ourselves, we see ourselves more broadly, and we've told a more interesting story. We've told the kind of story where someone can say, I was reading this memoir and essays by Kephart, interesting stuff about what it's like to be a daughter, what it's like to be a wife, how we define. But this thing about Henriette Wyeth, she was interesting. Well, then they have something to hold on to, not just the Beth Kephart story.
So you put it like in relief in a way, that juxtaposition creates
Perfect,
connections.
perfect. And it gets really interesting, like I did with my wife, my wife in paper. Boy, my life in paper. It's I wonder who my wife in paper would be. When
Are you
when
taking
we
applications?
yeah, I'll have to read them when I feel a little better. I took that book to the fourth dimension, and that Sean vigil at Temple allowed me to do that. Because the thing is, because there I'm twining myself with the history of, you know, of recipes, my mother's recipes, but then a really kind of side note history on recipes, of photographs, of homework, diaries, oatmeal box, whatever it is, sheet music, blueprints, family trees, rare books. So every time I twine myself with something like that, it's, you know, it's when you think about the hierarchy of the book, you think Beth is writing to Dard Hunter these very emotional pieces that are both about Dard, you learn his history, but they're a lot about Beth, who feels like she's failed, and Hunter felt like he failed. You know, if you try to map out this book, it's pretty hard to map it out. And what does that mean? It's impossible to have a one-line sales pitch. Impossible. And I think any other editor would have said, you know, how are we going to sell this book? And Sean didn't. He said, how far can you take it?
Mm.
I mean, let me just do it. And yes, it will probably only sell 1,000 copies. But I have the book that just like when I'm making these workshops, I solved the puzzle. And this is proof.
I love
But,
that.
you know,
Yeah.
with,
And
with,
I think that ties a little bit into the question that we have from Rebecca in the chat. What do you think of a narrative arc memoir compared to memoir and essays? People are encouraging Rebecca not to do essays because it doesn't sell as well, or maybe it doesn't have as much of a narrative impact. Do you have an opinion, essays versus a continuous narrative arc?
well, I've done 3 memoir and essays, if you want to count my second book, Into the Tangle of Friendships, as a memoir and essays, I'm sorry. And then Wife, Daughter, Self, and then My Life in Paper, you could call it that. I believe that every book does resolve itself into its singular best form, and that we shouldn't be listening to, for example, when Wife, Daughter, Self, you know, this book is sort of 3 arcs. What is it to be a wife? What is it to be daughter? What is it to finally define yourself? And so this is a bit of advice. So in Wife, Daughter, Self, the essays work together as an arc, right? The wife tells a story in essays, but it's from beginning, not chronologically, but thematically, beginning to end. This is what wife is. And each section begins with sort of an italicized thought about wife, and then daughter, the same thing. In my first approach, Into the Tangle of Friendship, I didn't have those dividing chapters. And so I think that book might feel, I'd have to look at it, I haven't looked at it for a long time, a bit more fragmented. And then My Life in, although it had, that book sold 12,000 copies, so it's something happened there. But My Life in Paper, I think because I hold these pieces inside these letters to Dard, and that they are all, if I'm talking to Dard about grief or loss or whatever it is, then the pieces all deal with that. So I think about having integrity within the whole, dividing it into thirds, dividing it into pieces, and having the narrative arc happen that way. Rather, and then I think that's a way that, and then when Laura Stanfield of Wife, Daughter, Self, she took, you know, it's distributed book, it's she took it out to Ingram, I guess it was, and they said, take a memoir and essays off, just call it a memoir. And Laura came back to me and she said, what do you think? And I said, well, what do you think, Laura? I love Laura, we're good friends now. I trusted her. And she said, you came to me describing this as a memoir and essays. It has always been a memoir and essays. We're going with memoir and essays, sales be damned. And I'm happy with that decision.
Mm. I think there's so many memoirs and essays now that are just called memoirs.
Yes.
Maggie Smith's is actually like flash
Yes.
prose, and
Yes.
Citizen is the same way. I think the readers are more flexible in what they expect from the genre, as the genre
Yes.
is kind of pushed out of those kind of boundaries as well.
And you know, we could have a long conversation about Maggie Smith's book, about whether or not among us here, she took advantage of the form by just, there might be a tad too many, modestly said here, repetitions or fallbacks to certain tropes that had she tried to write it as a narrative arc memoir, they would have been erased. But
Mhm.
even when you're doing, I think they might have been erased. Even if you're doing memoir and essays, you have to. Memoir and essays, number one skill is rhythm. Going back to choreography, you have to know when to place the urgent, when to place. Okay, this is my new book, which this is a collection of essays grouped into 6 parts. It's not pretending to be a memoir and essays, but you nonetheless you have a responsibility to hold within each of these segments like pieces. And what was really interesting to me when I was reading through this is I had this realization. I thought, Beth, in many of the sections, in 5 of the 6 sections, you're all out, Beth. You are urgent, you are lyric, you are flush right up against what's allowable with language. And interestingly, and I didn't realize until my second time of proofreading, that the section where I'm talking about paper crafts is where I'm most pragmatic, where I'm most, the sentences sound like normal sentences. And I thought, what the heck happened here? And then I realized that because I was writing about art, I didn't want to smash art on top of it. And so I needed just a little bit of, calm the language down. But still, the book is designed in a way, this new book, this essay book, where there's a blip, there's something crunched, there's something extended, there's a hard edge, there's a soft little whatever. And I'm very aware of the rhythm. So whatever you're writing, narrative art, memoir and essays that have segments, you have to be aware of the feel of, if you were skating it, if you were doing the Ina Bauer or the double axel where you were hitting the landing, you have to know what you're doing to the audience and to yourself. And that goes for the sentence itself, the unit of the sentence.
Love that. Emily asks a great question about your writing process. When you have an inkling of what you want to write about, what do you do next?
Oh, well, right now I have an inkling of something that is so ridiculously ambitious, because I want to combine my paper arts with a project that's both memoiristic and historical. And what I'm doing, very importantly, next is nothing, because it is such a big idea. Oh, well, I'm doing a lot of reading about these women that I want to feature, but it's such a big idea that it will scare me if I try to nail it down. But as I've said, we just came back from El Salvador, and it is a very rugged trip for someone as weak sister as me, who thinks that a whole Queen Mary needs to be the size of an ocean for her to get on the boat. I started writing in the clouds a piece called Descent. I could barely read my writing, but we were having it was a lot of turbulence. And I just had all these words. So I thought immediately then, so when I have a very big, ambitious project, I let it simmer for 6 to 9 months before I put a word or a piece of thread down. When I have something that feels immediate, like I think I have an essay in this very rugged, very difficult experience in El Salvador that we had, I am taking notes immediately. So in this journal of mine, I had the feeling I was writing emotionally about what it was to be up against the turbulence of the clouds, knowing that I was going to come up against some turbulence in El Salvador. And after I had that set, I just had 3 or 4 lines that I wrote on the plane. All I did for the rest of the trip when I could was writing details like the flame trees still bloom beneath the black smog, like Adolfo, who drives my mother-in-law's paralyzed except for the use of her left hand. And so she has a lot of help. And this young man in his early 30s drives her everywhere. He's remarkable. And I realized the second day in that he has some English. And so I just began to write down the sentences that he was saying in English. I knew where I wanted this piece to go. So I began to take, just with my phone, I didn't take a real camera, photographs. I'm going to want to remember what Adolfo looked like looking over this ridge where when my husband was a child, he almost was killed. I want to remember what this turtle looked like when it came around a corner. You're going to need that. So for an immediate essay where I kind of dissent, I knew that word that's going to carry through. It's going to be a braided essay. I knew I needed the mood written in full sentences before I landed. And then I need all those details written and photographed. And then I need time. I think that I'll write, not now, I'm not feeling well, but I think I'll try to write maybe no more than 300 words a week on that, because it's a big story and I will miss it when it's gone.
Oh,
I
wow.
love that. That's absolutely beautiful. We are getting near the end of our time, and we always try to leave our community with 3 things that you can do today to keep moving forward in your own journey in your life in paper. Before we do that, we want to remind you that coming up this weekend, you can take Beth's masterclass on writing character. I've dropped the link into the chat. It's going to be a fantastic class. It's a smaller group class as well, and there will be both listening and teaching and writing and sharing in that class. So if you're looking for that this weekend, that's coming up. And tomorrow I'll be teaching Writer Mind, Marketing Mind, which is all about how do we get all of this work into the world. Sharla, anything else we should mention before we get into our wrap up here?
I don't think so. I think, I don't know, I feel really full right now. I bet everyone feels really full right now. I'm just thinking about sharing that time with Beth. But I did put a link in the chat if you want to see what else is happening at Craft Talks.
Awesome. I love that. And for next month, we have the amazing Andrea Askowitz of Writing Class Radio joining us for the June Writers Bridge. We're going to talk about how to win the Moth Storytelling Contest, how to lose the Moth Storytelling Contest, and how sharing your story out loud can also help you write it on the page. Nancy asks, will the chat for this episode be shared? Yes, we will. We'll put a link in the YouTube replay so that you can get to it. And Nancy, if you want to drop me an email personally, just respond to the Writer's Bridge email. I will go ahead and send it to you directly as well. Let us leave you guys with 3 things that you can do today in your own life in paper. Sharla, what's your one thing today?
I'm going to take this question a little bit different. Being inspired by Beth to do what I feel inspired to do. What I've learned from Beth and her work and this time that we've shared together is that one should just allow themselves the freedom to explore various genres, different mediums without feeling confined to any sort of definition. That our diverse interests and experiences can enrich our artistry and lead to unexpected discoveries. No matter what we are doing, it all feeds the same river.
I love that.
Maybe just encouragement.
Beth, what's your one thing for us today?
Sharla, thank you. And this is a bridge to yours, which is to make something with your hands, whether it's pasta or planting a seed in the earth. I have come to know for sure that when we work with our hands, our minds are bigger.
I 100% agree. And we have some amazing visual artists in our group as well, who are writers as well as artists. And I want to leave you all with something that Beth's words reassured me about, which is it takes the time it takes. You don't have to rush it. You don't have to force it. I say this with great love in my heart. 99% of us are never going to become millionaires from our writing. So let's go ahead and honor the words along the way and let our words have the time they need to become the words on paper.
Love
Yeah.
that.
I have just been so honored by this invitation and by this community, by your questions. And I just want to leave you with the hope that your writing makes you more connected with yourself and with your world. That is its number one purpose.
I love that. Please, everybody, feel free to unmute yourselves for a joyful goodbye. Thank you so much for being here on the Writer's Bridge.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you
So much.
Bye,
Thank
Anne.
you. Thank you so
Loved
much.
it.
Thank you.
Anne.
Fabulous.
Hey, Morgan.
Bye.
Love you, Nina. Love you, Shar.
Feel better, Beth.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Love and peace. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Trevi.
Look at that. Just I love that.
Rebecca, that was some magic. I don't know how you did that.
I know. I get a lot of practice on our co-writing sessions. I try different things. There's
And if
another
you're
one.
watching this on the YouTube replay, do feel free to join us for co-writing 5 days a week. It's free and everyone is welcome. We'll put the link in the YouTube recording as well.